Thank you very much. Yeah, I thought maybe let's start with a nice graphic regarding ethical AI, but of course we are talking about serious business here. So my name is Tarek. I work for Ideas Engineering, which is a section of NMT, and I work as a innovation engineer. And innovation engineer is someone like a software engineer building prototypes for technologies that we are not using yet in regular business. For example, AR, VR technology or blockchain stuff that might be very important in the future, but right now not so much. We at Ideas Engineering, we work, of course, as some kind of contractor. Yeah, in the past we were like an external company, like a daughter of the Axel Springer IT. Today we are a section of NMT, and so whenever you have a project where you think you don't have the manpower or the expertise, come to Ideas Engineering and we will see how we can help you. Maybe even with experimental technologies like blockchain. Yeah, we are still searching for great use cases to place like AR, VR technology, blockchain, NFTs. We didn't find one yet. And one very, very interesting aspect that I want to bring to you today is something that I learned in San Francisco. In the beginning of this year, I was part of the Axel Springer, the Silicon Valley Fellowship Program. And this is, I had the option to fly for 8 weeks to San Francisco and the Silicon Valley and research a topic of my choice, and this was AI technology or AI first business development. And one aspect that I took with me there was this question of ethical AI. I talked to a lot of people from Microsoft, from Meta, from Apple, and one thing where the discussion always led to was the question of if we are applying ethical AI or if we are working with AI technologies in an ethical way or not, and if there is something like a framework that we could use, should use, or if it's not even possible to use ethical AI. And that's why I brought this with me. The big question is, are there more people who love AI or fear AI? Yeah? And some people even implant microchips into our brains so that we can merge with the AI in preparation for our AI overloads in the future. And this is actually a true story for the Neuralink startup, if you know Elon Musk. Yeah. But this is not only hypothetical. We have, of course, the classical fear of AI, where we say intelligent systems take over the world, robots will take my job, I will lose control of my privacy and data. There's too much data in too few hands, and we will live in a surveillance state, and robots will, of course, kill me, the classical fears. But even though we usually laugh about these things, there are these very valid concerns where we say the lack of transparency in algorithmic decision-making is something that we need to talk about. Because it's not really clear. We have bad actors doing bad things with AI. We have AI systems that might be vulnerable to tampering, and of course several data security issues, systems that are susceptible to bias, something that we talk every day about, laws not keeping up with technology, and of course how we can at the end trust these systems, where we say this nice system is doing some predictions for me, but I do not really know how it came to this prediction, so can I really trust it? Yeah? Or is it faulty or even maybe tampered with? Yeah? And one word that I learned in San Francisco was that this is a socio-technological problem. So it's not something that we can simply fix in code, but something that really touches us as a society. Yeah? And this means that we, or you engineers, or you managers, or you politicians might not be able to solve this on their own, right? This is something that we have to actually work together as a society to get something like a grip on this and really make sense of ethical AI utilization. And you might be familiar with this original framework for ethical AI that was written in 1942 by Isaac Asimov. These 3 laws of artificial intelligence or of robotics, where we say a robot may not injure a human being, but also a robot must obey the orders given by humans, and a robot must protect itself, but of course not if it endangers humans with this. And this is something that is smart and probably is still valid for today, where we say, okay, yeah, machines should do this, but it's probably not enough for what we are dealing with today. Yeah? So if we talk about robots or artificial intelligence, the question is not killing people actually enough to consider it ethical, right? Because there are machines and they are deciding if I get a loan or not. And there are machines who decide if I get a job interview, for example. Yeah, those are real use cases where AI is applied today in banking software, in HR recruiting software. There are cases where machines are screening 800 applications and pre-select those who are then invited to the interview. This is a machine without a human in the loop, right? So this is actually happening today. And so the question for Mr. Asimov would be, are these machines doing harm already, even though they are definitely not killing us, right? And this is what we have to talk about in regards of ethical AI. Yeah? So if we want to extend this framework from Isaac Asimov, we have to talk about, of course, the bad machines who are threatening lives and freedom and control and dignity, and even the environment, but also bad people. Yeah? And these bad people, they might violating our laws, trust, privacy, and also our lives with the way that they are using AI technology. We have bad practices. So even people who are have good intentions. Yeah, we are not bad people, but still we could have bad practices. And using these bad practices, we might have lack of safety, accountability, positive purpose, maybe even, and care for workforce disruption. And in terms of visibility, my question from before, when we use AI and train models and trust these prediction machines, do we actually know what is happening in there? So we have limited visibility into the data and the processes. We have limited disclosure and limited consent or the repeatability. Yeah, the machine is making a prediction, but maybe we can't actually reproduce the flow in there, and we can't really understand what is happening there. And so I started working with these so-called ethical frameworks. And if you're Googling for ethical frameworks, you find a lot of them. There's one directory from the Algorithm Watch, and they are creating something like a database for all ethical frameworks that there are, or at least the major ones. And they already have 167 guidelines or frameworks, so from different nations, from organizations, from corporations, who are trying to do exactly these things. And 167 is a lot. I started working through them, but this is of course very, very hard. And very, very lucky for me is that I found this comprehensive ethical AI framework from Cognilytica Research, which is doing exactly what I try to do. They went through the major 60 frameworks and compiled them to one big comprehensive framework, trying to get the essences of all of them so that we, the users and the developers, can use this to understand what aspects are important for developing ethical AI. And this is basically the thing that I would like to introduce to you, so that you are informed and educated in terms of the structure of a good ethical framework, so that we can at least talk on the same level when we talk about ethical AI. And the first aspect, oh no, wait, before we go into this, this is something that I personally think is very, very nice to get the structure of how these frameworks are working. So we have here something like a spectrum. This is something that I didn't think of. This is from this Cognilytica research paper, where they say all these aspects that we are analyzing to understand ethical AI go through this spectrum of societal, so touching our societal aspects, us as humans. We have the systemic aspects, and then on the other part of the spectrum, the technical aspects. And you will soon see why this is very important. So if we take a look at the societal column, we talk about this, ethical AI, which is this general thing, but actually ethics. And when we talk about ethics, this is something that we are teaching our children, right? What is right, what is wrong. And I looked up the definition in Britannica, and they say ethics, or so-called moral philosophy, the discipline concerned with what is morally good and bad and morally right and wrong. So we teach our kids, don't hit someone, this is something bad. Yeah, at the same time, go to school, learn a lot, this is good, right? And so this mental framework of what is good and bad is something that we can also use when we develop machines. So in this direction, we can talk about human values. Do no harm. We know this from Isaac Asimov, but this should always be the premise when we touch or use AI technology. We care with dignity, with fairness, diversity and inclusion, respect of environment, bias and discrimination, freedom and agency, human benefits, and human control. Those are all things that are self-understanding. Yeah? No one would say, yeah, this is a bad thing. We shouldn't teach our kids this, and so we should use this when we create AI technologies as a base level of what is regarded good and bad. And if we sum this up, we could say those are the things you shouldn't do, or in the other way, should do. Yeah? Our moral guidelines. So very, very far on the societal area of the spectrum. If we take a step further in the direction of systemic, we can talk about responsible AI. Yeah? So there might be things where we say it is not immoral, it is fine, but still not correct. So we could say we are trying to misuse AI technology, even though it's kind of in a moral gray area. And this is still something where we should take care of this. And an example is, I found an article about facial recognition, which is used by the police force in the US. And there were several cases where people were arrested based on AI technology, which did facial recognition and identified a suspect based on camera footage from a robbery, I think, or theft, something. And he was arrested, and he spent a year in jail because the prosecution said, okay, yeah, obviously he's the guy, and we still have to find some evidence. And a year later, they said, yeah, there's not really evidence. We can't prove that he's guilty. So yeah, he's a free man, yeah, after a year in prison. And all of this was based on this facial recognition technology, which said he is the bad guy who did the robbery. Yeah? But if we as engineers take a look at this, we know facial recognition is a prediction machine. Yeah? And it tells us something with a certain degree of certainty, yeah, and this means if the facial recognition software says, yeah, he's probably the guy, maybe with 85%, maybe 93%, but it's nothing where we say the machine is right, the machine knows it better than we do, yeah, and so putting someone into jail for a year simply because this prediction algorithm calculated for some reason that this face matches like this blurry camera image, this is very irresponsible. And so in terms of responsible AI, those are the cases where we have to take a look at and say, is this really the right way to use this technology, and are we actually understanding this? And if the police is using this technology, are they aware of what it is capable of and what not? And so in terms of responsible AI, we always have to take a look at the positive purpose that we are using it for: safety and security, trust, human accountability, privacy, misuse, abuse, and of course compliance with the laws. And yeah, this one is of course always important, the lethal autonomous weapons, right? So because we can use them, they are protecting us, or they are supposed to protecting us. But is this really something where we say this is a responsible use of AI technology? This question must be answered. So if we take a look back at our spectrum, this is the column that I use, that I call "Don't Abuse or Misuse AI." And we control this by laws and regulations. And this is exactly, again, mirrored by our society. We have our moral guidelines, but on top of that, we still have laws and regulations that give us another layer of understanding of right and wrong. Now we get into the systemic part, where we start getting a little bit more technical. And the systemic AI transparency means we need to understand what went into our machines to understand the results, right? So we take a look at image classification, for example. We have their images, and they can be pretty accurately assigned to a certain cluster of animals. And sometimes it goes wrong. So in this example, we see there's this deer, and it's identified as a magpie, like Elster, I think, in German. Or this cat identified as a dog. And this, okay, fine, can happen. But if this happens, for example, with the face of a robbery, yeah, and the suspect, then of course we need to understand where does it come from. Or this aspect where we had these cases where we understood that white faces, for example, are easier identified than brown-colored faces or black faces, right? And so those are the cases where we really need the system transparency to understand what data set, for example, was used, or how did we cluster the images or label the images before we actually trained our system. And without this transparency, we can't have visibility into this mechanism of using this machine. And so in this column, we talk about AI system transparency in terms of data, components, configurations, or even human decisions, which are also like, I don't know, the lead engineer did some adjustments because he thought, I don't know, it looks cool, right? We have bias, the measurement of bias and mitigation. Yeah, how do we handle this? How do we adjust to the aspects that we identified? And open systems. Yeah, it would be cool if we build our AI system on open source technology, so that we actually have a lot of feedback from the community looking into this and understanding how these systems are built. Yeah, and disclosure and consent in terms of when and how the AI is used, not in secret and somehow hidden. So if I am for some reason processed by an AI, I should know about this and should be able to react to this accordingly. Yeah, so in this column, I would say this is the assessment of our process and our pipeline and how we are working with, so that we have visibility into the data and components. The next one is AI governance. So how are we actually processing the things that we're working with AI? So in terms of audit, measure, regulate, guide, secure, provide, and process. So in the end, it's not only the development and applying of AI technology, but also guiding and enforcing it. Yeah? And here we start getting quite fuzzy, because with all these regulations, right now we have a lot of let's say, guidelines, but the question who is actually enforcing these regulations is not really clear in a lot of cases. And this means that we should, and this is now like this ideal way of handling this, have something like risk assessment and mitigation, where we say, okay, we have this nice system, but what exactly is it used for, and what is the consequence of the system, for example, failing? Yeah, if I have my archive and I have bird pictures and maybe there's a wrong bird identified, might not be so bad. But if someone is actually sent to prison for a year because my AI was working very poorly, this is a high risk situation, and so we should assess this and mitigate this at the right time, right? Oops. Of course, system auditability, so the ability to follow something like an audit trail and document all the processes that we do, so that we can actually have for example, some external company or some external person taking a look at how we came to these conclusions, or how we actually built this. Contestability, being able to actually say this is wrong, we have to fix this. The system controls, monitoring, verification, and of course the regulatory bodies and third-party certifications. Yeah? And here we come into an area where we, for example, at Axel Springer could talk about when we build something like AI software, how are we actually certifying that it is doing the things that it's doing? Yeah? And of course, if it's like a low-risk situation, maybe we don't want to have something like a third-party certification. But if it's something where we say, okay, it actually is something that influences our HR process, yeah, then this is something with a big impact. There we should have something like a regulatory body involved, or actually a certification. By the way, I don't know if we in HR are actually using things like that. It's just like an example. And of course, the educated workforce, where everyone who works with these tools or develops these tools should be somehow involved in the ability to audit this, or having like an oversight in there. And this means that if we talk about AI governance, it's govern and manage, and this is here starts to get very fuzzy, and the practices and processes to actually get there. And the final column is the algorithmic transparency, and I think this one is the most interesting one for us developers, because this is something where I'm not sure that we are actually that we actually can deliver what these frameworks are demanding. Yeah, even though we can still talk about the ideal system. And this is the so-called AI black box. We have sometimes neural networks which we use, for example, with unsupervised learning, and we are surprised how well the results are looking. But in the end, we might not be really understanding how we came to this conclusion or how the machine works. So we have some input and we generate some output. Maybe we like it, but we can't really understand what is happening in this black box, right? And so the algorithmic transparency demands that we have the ability to explain how decisions were made, meaning that we really look into it and understand, or build it in a different way so that we can understand it. And here's the question if this is actually possible. And I think there are cases where today we are not able to deliver on that. But this is a challenge, right? And these frameworks are like this. This should be the future. And this means if we take a look at these technical methods, the question of explainability. Are we able to actually explain how the system is working or coming to this conclusion? Yeah, this means understandability. So a human should be able to understand what is happening there. And this means if, for example, a child is working with an AI, this is, I'm not sure if this is something that is happening today, but with an AI-based system, the child should also be able to get this explanation why this machine is handling things the way it does. Should it be like a computer interacting with a child, a speech computer, an Alexa, I don't know. And the interpretability, where the system must be able to offer means to trace what is happening in there in terms of the data processed and generating this direct output. And so this is the so-called the spectrum of this comprehensive ethical AI framework from Cognilytica research. And I like this very much because if you look at these other frameworks from the United States, from Europe, or even from the companies from IBM, they have a lot of very fuzzy terms in there. And it's sometimes really hard to understand what they are talking about. And this spectrum helps a little bit getting the structure in there. And sometimes these frameworks, they are only like doing things on this part of the spectrum or only having some tools over there, but they are lacking this big picture of what we are actually trying to achieve here. Yeah. And another very interesting paper that I read on Algorithm Watch was after they went through all these documents, they assessed that in the realm of paper tigers, exploring the failings of AI ethic guidelines, it shows that we really have a problem here, because with all these guidelines, they still see that these guidelines are lacking enforcement mechanisms, right? So we always say this should be done, and this should look like this, and this should be, but nobody is actually caring about enforcing and putting all these guidelines into good use. And this is the difference between our laws that we actually live by. If I steal a car, I will go to jail. This is the law. But if I break these AI ethic guidelines, nobody cares, because there's not really a regulatory body that enforces these rules, because they are not rules, they are guidelines. And this means we have a lot of these wordings that play down the scope of these documents, and it always reads like this orientation or a proposal. Yeah, you should take care of this, and you should think about this. And these vague formulations, they give you the option to believe that there is a good intent, and then you can sleep well. But it also does not really force the company following this to actually do something. And without this clear view, how to actually apply these things in practice, the responsibility is then with us. Yeah? So we are building the system. Nobody tells us how we can achieve, for example, removing this black box and actually take a look at how we can find this answer to how we came to this decision. But still, this guideline says, yeah, you should do it. Yeah? And so it feels more that most of these ethical guidelines, they are used as a PR tool. So Microsoft, I don't know, IBM, they have these amazing guidelines, and they tell us we are working in an ethical way, and all of our AI development, everything very ethical, we have this guideline, right? But I'm not sure if this is actually intended for the developers or the consumers, but more like for this positive company image. And so the question is, with these guidelines, we have AI ethical guidelines in Europe and US and Germany, for example. Yeah? Are they really important for us? Does anyone care if we read them or work according to them, because they don't have really consequences? On the other hand, there are these guidelines from Microsoft, IBM, Google, and everybody else who's actually building these systems where the world is running on top of, right? And so my view is not to read the guidelines that are written by the federal government of Germany, because nobody cares. But at the end, on the other side, I'm very interested to read what is Google following, which ethical guidelines is following Google. So we are somehow already governed in this direction by the corporations. Yeah? And this might be a problem, because our federal government is elected and working for the people. Their job is to serve us and our needs. But on the other side, these corporations, Microsoft, IBM, Google, Amazon, they are for-profit corporations. So their job is not really to serve us. They are earning money, right? And so reading their ethical guidelines, it's always the question of how are they motivated. Yeah? And this means for us, this is my call to action to all of us, for you engineers, you managers, you politicians, our job is to learn these guidelines, to really understand what the essence is in there, apply them, and improve them. Yeah, and this is like a movement. I'm not sure. I didn't find this article. I just thought about this. There was this case, I think, with Microsoft, where they had some contracts, and don't quote me on this, I'm not sure if I have the right company here, but I think it was Microsoft. They had some contracts with the US military or something, and so the AI software that they were developing was used for military use. And so the developers, they were very unamused about this, because they said, yeah, our machine learning, we did not want to program like missile guiding systems with this. This is not the intention of what we did there. And so they started laying down their work and wrote like a petition to the management. I really should have search for this article, because I'm not sure if it was really Microsoft. And they said, yeah, you have to adjust like the policy of how to apply the technology that we are using, because we do not want to kill people with our technology. And so they forced the management to change this course and cancel these contracts, because otherwise they would have quit, and like losing 1,000 like AI engineers is very, very painful. And so it was actually a movement led by the developers. I'm not sure if at the end there was this twist where they created this fuzzy AI ethical guideline there where nothing really was written in there, and so everybody was happy, even though nothing really changed. But this is something, you should Google it. This was one of these cases that I personally find very inspiring, and it shows that we who are developing these systems and who are buying these systems, for example, by the big corporations, actually have power in changing the course of how this is all developed and applied, right? And so we shouldn't only like point the finger to these corporations and say it's their fault and their obligation, because we are part of this, yeah, let's say AI revolution and AI uprising of technologies, which we are seeing now every year in a very, very fast sense. And so we should take the responsibility of making these ethical AI guidelines actually a part of our moral code. Yeah, and Axel Springer is also a company who's at least using and developing in some degree these systems. And so with every line of code that we are writing and every system that we are building, we should be responsible for the things that we are using it for, and speak up if we have the feeling that this aspect of for-profit of our organization gets in the way of these ethical standards that we all should stand in for. Yeah. And this is one of the topics that we regularly discuss, or at least in this direction, in our Tech Review podcast, which is actually happening today in the forum downstairs at 4:15. We are streaming live. It's the first time that we have this as like a podcast recorded and live streamed with a real audience. So if you want to, you can join in, and we even have a spare seat on the stage. So if there's an article that we are discussing that you find really interesting and you want to give us your opinion, you can jump onto the stage and discuss with us. Yeah. Otherwise, you can of course watch us as a video podcast online or on the podcast platforms. Yeah, and that's it. Am I in time? I am in time.